I did want to start out just by saying a couple of things just to give you a sense for what I think is sometimes happens, which is that sometimes mythicists mount arguments that for me at least, are not very convincing. The first argument that I find completely unconvincing, that some of you have heard and maybe have found convincing, is the idea that Jesus of Nazareth could not have existed because Nazareth did not exist. There was no Nazareth. I simply have never found this argument to be anywhere close to persuasive for two reasons. One reason is archaeologists have dug where ancient Nazareth was, and they've discovered that it was there. This is not a debated point among Palestinian archaeologists, several of which are good friends of mine. They don't debate whether Nazareth existed because they have dug it and they found it. They've uncovered a house there, they've uncovered a farm there, they've uncovered pottery there, they've uncovered coins there. The pottery and the coins date to the days of Jesus. Certainly, Nazareth did exist. It's been shown to exist. Anyone who thinks otherwise simply doesn't know the archaeological record. I'm afraid it's that simple. The second reason for not being convinced by this, though, is this. Saying that Jesus did not exist because he could not have been born in Nazareth is like saying Barack Obama doesn't exist because he couldn't have been born in America. What everyone thinks about the birther issue, and judging from your show of hands, I think most of you don't subscribe to it, it's got nothing to do with whether Barack Obama actually exists or not. Same with Nazareth. Second mythicist argument that people make is that if Jesus' life, as described in the Gospels, follows certain set patterns that you can see in Old Testament stories, or in myths about dying and rising gods, or in tales told about other religious figures, that if these stories are in these set traditions, then probably Jesus didn't exist. I've never found this persuasive either. Most historical figures that we have accounts of have legendary tales told about them in set patterns. That was true for George Washington. It's true for Julius Caesar. It's true for the founder of Hasidic Judaism, the Baal Shem Tov, who allegedly could heal the sick and cast out demons and raise the dead and be transfigured before his followers. Does that mean he didn't exist? No, everybody knows that Baal Shem Tov existed. There's no doubt about that. I could illustrate this by giving point after point. Let me just give you one more detailed illustration. Octavian, Caesar Augustus, the first Roman emperor. Literally, he was allegedly the Son of God. He was miraculously born. He was revered as the Son of God by his devotees. He ascended to heaven. He is a divine being worthy of worship. There are all these tales told about him. Does that mean he didn't exist? No, it means that when you tell stories about him, you tell these stories in certain ways. This is typically what happens with important figures from the past. Famous people are told in terms of stereotypes. We have our own stereotypes. We have the rags to riches story. We have the politician's sexual exploits story. We have the divine savior story. The fact that stories are molded to a model has no bearing on whether the person actually existed or not. Now let me get to my positive argument. Jesus of Nazareth is one of the best attested Palestinian Jews of the entire first century. From the year 1 of the Common Era, 1 CE, to the year 100 CE, we know that there were hundreds of thousands of Jews living in Palestine. How many of those Jews are better attested than Jesus? One, Josephus the historian. He's attested better only because he left us multiple writings. If you look only at external attestation for first century Palestinian Jews, Jesus actually is much better than Josephus. We have 4 Gospels written about him. These Gospels come from the very next generation after his life. Contrast that with Josephus. We have 0 negative accounts of the Jewish historian Josephus. How many narrative accounts do we have for the most powerful religious figure in Jesus' day, Caiaphas, the high priest Caiaphas? We have no narrative accounts. How many narrative accounts do we have for Pontius Pilate, the most powerful man in first century Palestine? We have no narrative accounts. How many accounts do we have for anyone else in first century Palestine? We have no narrative accounts. It's not even close. I'm not saying that the gospel accounts are non-problematic. As some of you know, I've made an entire career out of arguing that they're problematic. There are enormous problems with the Gospels. And so Bob and I are not going to be disagreeing about that. They are absolutely problematic. But they are four narratives about a person living in first century Palestine, and they do give us a lot of real information. These four Gospels we have, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are not simply one Gospel in four forms. They are four Gospels based on different literary and oral sources. The Gospel of Mark was probably written sometime around the year 70 of the Common Era. Jesus died around the year 30 of the Common Era. Mark is absolutely based on oral traditions that the author had heard. Matthew and Luke used Mark as one of their sources, but they had other sources available to them. Matthew and Luke had one other source that they shared together that no longer exists. Scholars call it Q. Matthew had other sources that Luke did not have. Luke had other sources that Matthew did not have. That means prior to the writing of the Gospels, you've got sources for Mark, different sources for Matthew and Luke, different sources for Matthew, different sources for Luke, and we're not even talking about John, which didn't use Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and had different sources of his own. These are multiple independent sources from the first century. How is it possible that you have so many sources about somebody who never existed? These sources are independent of each other. They're not copying one another. You have independent sources from before the Gospels. Some of these sources have traditions in them that almost certainly go back to Aramaic-speaking Palestine. Some of these sources record sayings of Jesus in which he uses Aramaic words known only in Palestine. Some of the sources contain stories that make sense if you translate them back into Aramaic, better sense than they make when they're given in Greek. That shows the stories started out as Aramaic stories. You have Aramaic stories about Jesus from Palestine, years before the Gospels. These are stories in Aramaic Palestine that almost certainly go back to the 30s of the Common Era. Multiple sources. This is far better than anybody that we have in Palestine in the entire first century. It's better than almost anybody we have in the ancient world, with exceptions that we all could probably cite.